thanks to everyone who's taken the time to attend the webinar. Please enter any questions in the question box on the webinar screen during the presentation, and I'll answer as many questions as I have time for at the end of the talk. So the title of the talk is Small, Bright, and Beautiful, Emerging Applications of Plasmonic Nanoparticles in Life Science. I'm going to spend some time in the beginning of the talk describing what a plasmonic nanoparticle is, describing some of the unique properties of this class of materials, and then I'm going to finish with some example applications. But first, I'd like to give you a quick introduction to NanoComposix. We're really in the mission of helping people commercialize nano, so bringing nano from the concept stage all the way through to commercialization. So no matter where you are in that cycle, we'd really like to help. If you're at the very beginning, proof of concept in the research stage, we've got 500 different sizes and shapes and materials that we can use to, or you can use to do proof of concept experiments. If those results look promising, we can provide larger volumes or produce custom batches of materials that are tailored to your research. For some of our customers, we develop a more in-depth relationship where we're primarily responsible for completing the R&D work and scaling up the production of the material. Currently, we support more than 10 different startups in their commercialization effort, which is really exciting because we get to see work with a lot of bright people and have a lot of passion about leveraging these types of materials and getting them into the market. And finally, when the customer is ready, we can provide commercial supply within an ISO or GMP compliant quality system. So this is sort of our world. We're in this metal oxide nanoparticle space. So for core materials, we're very interested in gold and silver as plasmonics. We do a lot of work with iron oxide, which has magnetic properties, titanium dioxide, which is photocatalytic. We use silica, which is a glass, for its versatility in terms of creating precise layers and structures and embedding different types of chemistry into the core. We've done a lot of work with antimicrobials such as copper oxide. And then within that core, what we can do is we can functionalize the surface. And so we can use chemistry to change the surface ligands to make it more compatible with different resins. We can covalently bind it to different surfaces, create different charges for assembling, and often we biofunctionalize the surface, give it some kind of a targeting ability to antibodies or DNA. In addition to the core, we can produce multiple layers, different core shell geometries. We use silica as a shell, often putting fluorescence or other materials into that silica shell, and then gold, which has creates another class of plasmonic materials. In addition to the spherical particles, we're very interested in shapes. So we make cubes, plates, rods, wires, hollow materials, and a variety of other different geometries, all of which have a real reason for doing them. They have different tunabilities, different properties that we can take advantage of. Everything that we do is what's called bottom-up nanomaterial assembly. So instead of taking a material and just grinding it into smaller and smaller pieces, we're using chemistry to fabricate the base particles from molecules in solution. And then we use further chemical techniques to process, to concentrate, to coat, or to form different types of shapes and sizes that we're looking for from an end application. Before I go on, I wanted to pause here and conduct a short survey to see how many of you listening today have worked with nanomaterials before. So click yes if you've worked with materials or had experience with them, or click no if you're just interested in the materials but haven't had direct experience with them yet. I'll just give you guys a couple of minutes to conduct that survey. All right. Wow, okay, so basically almost everybody, 90% of the people responding have had a direct experience with these materials. And so given that, most of you know that the reason why these materials are interesting is not because they're small, it's because they're different. There's something about their properties at the nanoscale that provides an advantage over all other materials that you could potentially use. And that's important because in many cases, the cost of these nanomaterials can be quite high, and the advantages in that performance really have to outweigh the costs of production. All right, so today I'm going to talk to you about just such an example where this price-performance ratio makes sense, and that's for a type of material called a plasmonic nanoparticle. And these particles really leverage a unique material property, which is primarily found in gold and silver at the nanoscale, and to generate a color in a way that's really completely different than standard dyes or pigments. So the basis of the effect is due to what's called a surface plasmon resonance, and this occurs when a metal particle, so like I said, gold or silver, which has these free electrons, is in an electromagnetic wave. And as that light wave goes by, those electrons can get driven into one side of the particle or to the other side. And so what happens is that these electrons are essentially sort of sloshing back and forward. And the strength of that oscillation is dependent on what's called the polarizability, and that's that formula to the right here. So this is the polarizability, and this is a function of the geometry of the particle, but also the material properties of the particles. These epsilons here represent the dielectric function of gold and silver, and they're wavelength dependent. So what happens, and what's really unusual about gold and silver, is that in some cases this formula, the denominator of the formula can get small, and when that happens, then the polarizability gets very large, and then that means that there's a very strong effect, and that happens at a specific wavelength for a specific size. So this formula is for a spherical particle, but for different geometries, the form of this formula will be different. So what this means is that we've got the ability to essentially tune this coupling of light to the particle by adjusting the material, the size and the shape, and the environment. And what that means is that we can essentially go back to theory and some of our nanoengineering tools, and we can build a particle that'll have a particular color. So let's take a little bit of a couple of concrete examples. So for gold and silver, so this is the red solutions at the top left here are gold particles ranging from about 10 nanometers to 100 nanometers. Their color in solution is primarily due to their absorbance, and so they absorb in the green, and so that means they're transmitting the remaining light that's coming back to you as red. And if you look at that in a dark field microscope, you actually see that green scattering. They appear as green point sources of light. So red in solution under a microscope where you're just looking at the scattering intensity, they appear bright green. For the silver particles, you get a similar effect. So again, sort of ranging from sort of 10 nanometers out to about 100 nanometers, looks yellow in solution. And then when you look at it on a dark field microscope, you get very sharp, distinct point sources of blue. Now, if you go and change the shape, those were spherical particles. If we move to something like a silver nanoplatelet, so these are sort of triangular or hexagonal structures, maybe 10 to 12 nanometers in thickness and 50 to 150 nanometers in diameter. These effectively function as nanoscale antennas where we can adjust the peak wavelength, where they resonate, by adjusting that diameter and the ratio between the diameter and the thickness of the particles. So here we can take particles all the way out from sort of 600 nanometers out to 1,000 nanometers, and in some cases we can go even further to get out to areas that are interesting from optical coherence tomography and some other applications. The other shapes that are available, gold nanorods are an example. Here we've got one narrow dimension and two narrow dimensions around the diameter of the particle or the width of the particle, and then we can adjust the diameter to different lengths. And by playing with that ratio, we can shift things out in the visible and way out into the infrared as well. Silver nanocubes have a different shape, and the shape has a different plasmon resonance structure. Different modes are being excited at different locations. And so in the upper section, we've got some 75 nanometer particles that scatter green, and we've got some slightly larger cubes that'll scatter out and give it kind of a ruby red appearance in the dark field scattering. A different geometry is where instead of having a solid metal, we can actually start with a glass core, a dielectric core. In this case, it's a silica. And here we make an encapsulation of that silica with a gold shell. The way that we make them is we start with very small particles of gold on the surface, and we grow those particles bigger until they coalesce into a complete shell. And in here, the wavelengths, so that Plasmon resonant wavelength that we can address is even more varied. We can start with cores that are as big as 400 or 500 nanometers, and that puts the resonance way out into the infrared. So we have a lot of tunability based on the core size that we start with. Very unusual optical properties. These materials will appear almost a rust orange in scattering, but then cast a blue shadow. So again, color generation that you really can't produce in any other way except through these plasmonic particles. One of the other things that we've been working on is, in addition to changing the size and the shape, we're also very interested in getting very high purity, very low CV, so coefficient of variation, particle formulations. And this is important when we want the dark field scattering to be extremely uniform. So if we want something to be exactly the same intensity and the same color, every particle has to have approximately the same shape. And so we've got some chemistry methods to do that. We're really interested in kind of following ways of making uniform structures that have the ability to even self-assemble because their shapes are so uniform. So beyond that, this is an example of some of the first applications. So you've seen these particles under dark field microscopy. And these particles, since they're so bright and colored, actually can be used as labels. So these are used in biological systems for cellular imaging, intracellular tracking, for microarrays. And one of the advantages is that unlike conventional fluorescent dyes, these particles don't bleach and are extremely bright considering that their size. And one of the other advantages is that since this color that you're seeing is a function of its geometry, if two particles stick together, then they effectively have a different geometry, and that different geometry will result in a color shift. So this is a way of adding these things into a biological system, watching them in real time, and if an event occurs, if the particles touch, or in some cases if something else binds to it, you'll see a shift in the color, which will be a real-time indication of a biological event. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize was that the properties of these materials, it's not really just about their color. There's some other things that are extremely important for why these materials are interesting. And one of these is cross-section. And so what I mean by cross-section is that typically in the macroscopic world, the amount of light that is going to be that an object's going to interact with is directly proportional to its cross-sectional area. So if you shine a flashlight on a tennis ball, it's going to cast a shadow, and that shadow is going to be about the size of the object that you're illuminating. Now, what's unusual about these plasmonic materials is that in some cases, that shadow that they're casting when they get hit in the light can be much larger. In fact, it can be almost a factor of 10 greater than the physical cross-section of the particle. And of course, this doesn't really make sense at the macroscopic scale, but when you've got particles that are less than the wavelength of light, this is possible. And so this is really kind of one of the fundamental reasons why this class of material. These things are focusing light in a way that's very unusual, and that light focusing means that if they're scattering, that you can see them. If they're absorbing, that they're heating up. And then if you've got something on the surface, the electromagnetic fields are enhanced, and you can use them to improve some sensing mechanisms such as Raman and fluorescence. So we're trying to leverage that throughout all of the application spaces that we're interested in. The second thing that's interesting about these materials is that they have a tunable ratio of scattering and absorption. And for a traditional dye or pigment, they're almost always absorbing, and if you make it smaller or larger, you're still going to have an absorbing particle. for the plasmonic materials, when you're in this range of sort of 10 to 100 nanometers, that's right where things can shift in terms of the transition from being almost a complete absorber. So down in the 10 or 20 nanometer regime, they're basically just absorbing light. The solutions look colored, but they look clear. And as you move more into the 100 nanometer regime, you start to get a significant amount of scatter. And so that they'll still have a strong interaction at that same wavelength, the plasmon resonant wavelength, but the light will be scattered from the particle instead of just being absorbed and converted to heat. And there's a couple of reasons that I'll show you later on of why that's interesting and important. And finally, I wanted to give you an example of sort of the unusual nature of these plasmonic materials. And this is a substrate or two substrates that were brought to me. And I remember when I first saw this, I asked, well, what are those two materials that were used to print the two different colors? And then I was told that it was actually the same material. So this is 50 nanometer silica coated silver. And the only difference is that it's printed on two different backgrounds. And this is a little bit bizarre, but if you break it out into trying to understand what's going on between the scattering and the absorption, it kind of makes sense. So these silver particles both absorb and scatter light right around 400 nanometers. So that's in the blue. So on a black background, when you've got white light coming in, you get a scatter from those particles. So that's a little bit of the blue light. And then the green and red light is just completely absorbed by the substrate. And so that's why it appears blue. And then on a white background, what happens is you get a little bit of the blue coming back off, but you get a lot of the green and the red coming off, and that actually dominates. And so what you see there is a combination of green and red light, which gives you the yellow. So when we think about plasmonic color, we're always asking ourselves, well, what's different about this? Why should we use this instead of just some traditional dye? And there's some very subtle, unusual effects associated to having both a scattering color and an absorbing color that we can leverage for different applications. Right. And so that brings me to talking about some of the things that you can do with this. So I've given you an overview of why these materials are different, why they've got properties that just aren't replicated anywhere else in our material world, and then how do we leverage that in a way that makes sense. So one class of materials is biodiagnostics. These particles are very easy to see, even though they're extremely small. So lateral flow tests, and I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail in a couple slides. Imaging, so just labeling up materials visible near infrared, out in the farther infrared for OCT, and then sensing. So using that surface as a way of reporting back what's happening in a local environment. The other class that's used is in this class of photothermal heating, and so this is where you're making, instead of a scatterer, you're making primarily an absorber. And the absorber is very efficient at taking light, which is usually provided in either an LED or a laser, and converting that to heat. And there's some topical applications of using that for acne and hair removal. And then there's been a lot of interest in cancer. Here's a particle that's of the size that can be easily functionalized and delivered to a certain location in the body, and then we can hit it with light and create heat, and that it's a photodynamic effect where you can kill or damage some of the cells that you've targeted, all in a completely non-chemical way. So no chemo, no drugs, just a heat and some very safe inert material. So it shows a great deal of promise in terms of providing some of the benefits without some of the drawbacks of certain types of therapies. And then the last category is antimicrobial, and this is for silver. It's probably the most common use of these silver nanomaterials. And one of the ideas that we've had here is to combine that antimicrobial application with some colorimetric, some of the plasmonics, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too. So, walking through, I thought I'd give one example from each of those classes. The first one is lateral flow. So lateral flow is something that interact with very commonly. It's in every drugstore, and one example is the pregnancy test. So the red lines in that pregnancy test are actually 40 nanometer gold nanoparticles. And so it's probably one of the most ubiquitous nanoparticle applications that nobody knew was nano. And the way that it works is it's very simple. It's got basically a series of different components that are glued together, and you use the wicking nature. So it's basically no power, but just a capillary draw to operate the actual assay. So what happens is you'll add your sample at the sample pad. There's some gold nanoparticles or some other nanoparticles dried on a conjugate pad, and then those particles will interact with your sample. And when they interact with your sample, you can get binding of an analyte that's in your sample to the surface of the gold. And then if and only if that analyte has bound to the gold particle, it'll stick to the capture or the test line. And so in the case of pregnancy, for instance, the HCG antigen is in there, and that'll bind to the particles and give you the 2 lines. So 2 lines if you're pregnant, and then there's a control line that just makes sure that the assay is actually working. And so that's a very simple, low-cost method for doing a biological assay. And typically, production costs are less than $1, and so this is really suitable for third world applications for disease. Very powerful, very ubiquitous, and is made in the sort of the billions of tests per year. But one of the issues is that while these gold particles are sensitive, they're often not quite as sensitive as we would like. So one of the questions that we asked is, what else could you do? Is there another particle out there that would be better for lateral flow? So out of the library of all the things that we have in NanoComposix, we investigated a wide number and found that these gold nanoshells, which are larger, have that cross section, that tunable Plasmon wavelength that we can put at different locations, and then have this silica core, which reduces their density and makes it easier to flow than if it was just a solid particle. And what we found is that we get anywhere from sort of 6 to 20-fold increases in sensitivity, and that's really important because there's a whole slew of assays out there that were developed, but they just didn't quite have the commercial sensitivity in order to get them to market. So we're hoping that some of these materials will help with that. This is an example. So the gold nanoshells, instead of looking red, they have a sort of a blue-green tint to them. And here you can see that you can read a test line. We can get all the way down these sort of half-log dilutions down to this bottom test line here. A little faint to see, but we've actually spent a lot of effort using cell phone readers and other types of digitization that allow you to quantify lines at a very low dilution level. And if you compare that to the gold particles, here we're sort of losing the ability to see things down at this third iteration. So this gives us a good way of comparing the two and getting that sensitivity boost. The second application is this photothermal application. So here, this is selective heating of targeted plasmonic nanoparticles, and really provides a safe and effective method for modulating cell response. So getting the particles to a certain location, hitting them with some heat source, and then seeing some results. And here, the company that we've been working with is called Sienna Labs, and they are utilizing some of our materials. This is a silver nanoplate that's coated with a thin shell of silica. And here we've tuned the resonance out into the near infrared. So what happens is the light comes in, you get this oscillation, this resonance, the particles are mostly absorbing, and it converts that to heat. And the application one of the applications that Sienna Labs is looking at is as an acne treatment. So what we do is we make a very high concentration of these solutions, rub it on the skin. There's a little transducer that sort of vibrates and sends those particles deep into the hair follicle. And then when you hit it with near-infrared light, you can get this thermal injury zone right around the sebaceous gland, and that'll basically modulate the oil production and can provide a permanent cure to acne. So this is something that's in clinical trials now, and we're hoping to have a launch, as a commercial launch, as early as next year. Another application is antimicrobial. So this is probably the most ubiquitous application for silver particles, mostly due just to their high surface area. And so you're providing a very high surface area for the release of silver ions that's been incorporated into sort of hundreds of different products. And we're actually working with a number of companies to tune the size and the shape of these particles to get an ion release profile that's really optimal for whatever the application is. So if you use slightly larger particles, we can have a slower release over time. And with smaller particles or shaped particles, we can get a much faster release. In addition to just sort of the basic antimicrobial properties, we were interested in combining that with plasmonics. So what we came up with here is a concept called ActiBlu. And what we do is we have these plates, the silver nanoplates, and in this case, we've sort of soaked a foam with these plates that gives them a blue. And so what happens is, in a salty environment, the dissolution of the plates is accelerated, and the etching of the plates occurs at the edges and then works its way in. And like I said before, that you remember the color or the resonance wavelength that we're at is dependent on that diameter. So if we're changing that diameter, we're going to start to see a color shift, and that's exactly what happens. And so you can see that at the beginning, it just looks wet, but then over time, you start to get these color shifts associated with the changing of the shape of the particles. And this can give you a sort of a time history of exposure. And one of the places that's interesting is in sort of these time use concepts. So changing of color in ambient air, sort of as a humidity monitor. And we've also been looking at placing these things or integrating these concepts into a bandage. So you would have something that would give you a color shift that would indicate when a bandage needs to be changed due to saturation, or through the timing of a deliverable associated with something that's a patch where something had to come up. So that was just really wanted to just kind of give you guys a flavor, a little bit more in-depth look at plasmonics and why plasmonics works, and then talk about a few applications. So with that, if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Yes, thank you, Steve. We're going to answer some of the questions that the audience has submitted during the presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the question pane. Steve, our first question comes from Iris. She wants to know, how do silica-coated particles affect plasmon resonance for gold or silver particles?
Yes. So the plasmon resonance is a function of the environment, and when we say it's a function of the environment, usually we're talking about the refractive index of the environment. So depending on what that refractive index is, it'll shift the particles, the peak one way or the other. So silica typically has a higher refractive index than water, and so what happens is that thin silica shell will typically redshift the resonance. So it'll move it a little bit to a longer wavelength. So that's one of the knobs that we have when we're tuning the color of these materials, is that by changing this coating, that we can fine tune where we're placing that resonance. And then the other advantage of silica is that we found that silica is it's happier to be at higher concentrations. It's more salt resistant. It has a number of other sort of surface properties that are good for long-term stability. So those are really the two things that we use it for: stability and sort of fine-tuning the resonance wavelength.
Thank you, Steve. Got another question from Gary. This was on the plasmonic perceived color slide. He wanted you to further define the scattering ratio that you're referring to.
Yeah. So I'd have to look back exactly at the split, but it's close to, in that sort of 50-60 nanometer regime, we're getting close to 50-50 splits in the scattering and absorption for those particles.
Okay, this question comes from Christopher. He wants to know if what the difference is between displaceable versus a conjugatable surface.
Right, that's a great question. So so in many cases, people are always asking for a naked particle, something that where there is nothing else on the surface, presumably because they want that to not interfere with some other downstream event, or because they want to put something else onto the surface. So in lateral flow, for instance, most of the lateral flow devices are just done by absorption. So this is where you'll take a particle with a displaceable surface, meaning that it's got a molecule on the surface that's only weakly bound. So if you put a protein or something else there, the protein is going to stick and displace the ion that was stabilizing the gold nanoparticle. And that's one way of getting a protein to bind to the surface. For most of what we do, we're using a covalent binding. So we're putting something specific on the surface, and then we're using a heterobifunctional cross-linker to covalently link that surface to the biologic that we're looking for. That seems like that's more robust. We often have more control over orientation, and it gives us ultimately better performance.
Great, thank you, Steve. So the next question comes from Mason. This is referring to the photothermal application. What is the impact of the single versus ensemble particle line width for photothermal applications?
Yeah, so the plasmonics, so we talk about these plasmonics having peaks, but generally the peaks are relatively broad compared to other sort of other peak things in photonics. So fluorescence is in quantum dot emissions are relatively narrow, and plasmon resonances are generally broader. If the particles are very uniform in size and shape, the single particle and the ensemble particle widths are very similar. As you get more and more dispersity in size or shape, then you can get a broadening of that line width. But typically, when we think about photothermal applications, we're really just looking at an OD per, what's the optical density at this particular wavelength as it is applied and being hit by the laser. So if we've got something a little bit more, a little bit broader, we might just have to use a little bit more in order to get that correct OD to get the heat transfer in. So it's important, but in a lot of these applications, it's not so critical, and we're close enough in terms of our CVs and our homogeneity that it doesn't become a huge issue.
Great, thank you, Steve. This question comes from Mark. Will the silver nanoparticles be more stable than gold nanoparticles when used in a lateral flow test?
Yeah, so typically typically people have used gold, and gold is more stable than silver. So silver has a finite dissolution constant, and that's why we can leverage that in some cases to get ion release for antimicrobial or some of these color changing aspects. But when we use them in lateral flow, the time scale of that dissolution is long enough that we still have plenty of time in order to get that binding event and for us not to lose any covalent binding or linkage to the chemistry. So what we found is that the silver particles work well as lateral flow probes, but typically it's not a common material for lateral flow. Most people use gold.
Great, thank you. The question from David. I've had difficulty with proprietary coatings from other suppliers. Are you guys open about the type of coatings that you offer?
Yeah, at NanoComposix, we made a decision pretty early on that, since we're supporting the scientists and we're supporting the people that are doing R&D, it's really important that they know as much as possible about the particles. So we basically don't have any proprietary coatings, and the spec sheets that we have list all of the information that we know associated with the characterization of the particles. And that makes it a little bit easier for people to understand what's going on, and plus de-risks things in case the proprietary coating had changed in some way that wasn't communicated to the customer. So we're hoping that people appreciate that, and that they can leverage that knowledge into doing better science.
Great, thank you. I think that's all the questions that we have for now. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Small, Bright, and Beautiful, Emerging Applications of Plasmonic Nanoparticles in Life Science. If you have any other questions, please contact us by email at info@nanocomposix.com. On behalf of NanoComposix and our presenter, Steve, thank you for joining us today. Please have a great rest of your day.